If I am feeling depleted after a long day of work, or when things in this world are feeling heavy and unsolvable, and my hopeful self feels very far away, I've learned I can usually find it down at a river. My bike has led me to some just magical spots at the edge of creeks and rivers in town here, which have become regular touch points for me, and important elements in what I would presume to call a prayer practice. During a recent visit like this, it was one of our gorgeous spring days of late, and this spot on Laurel Creek was just magnificent in the light, and I felt a wave of love for this river, as though it were a person very close to me. There's this question about whether rivers are alive that I mention in my annual report for the AGM, which is coming up next hour. A related question I explored recently with some other local pastors who share a similar prayer practice, is whether a river is a self when it's constantly moving and flooding and drying up, and when it's just a tributary into a larger river, which is itself a tributary into a great lake. It's a good way to think about what it means for us humans to be selves, when we're often just as shifty and dependent. This wave of love that I felt called up some of this kind of thinking. What manner of being was I feeling love for? Was it water? Was it spirit? And I wondered how much I was anthropomorphizing this body of water in front of me, loving only what I was projecting onto it, loving my own reflection, even though what I was seeing was light moving to show the rocks underneath the ripples, or reflecting trees and sky and the world all around me. It's a little risky talking about narcissism from a pulpit like this. But I'm going to do it anyways and just blame Laurel Creek for the idea. I'm definitely not a psychology expert, and I think it would come off as a bit narcissistic of me to pretend that I understand it all that well. On the other hand, you do have people like Jacques Lacan, the famous French psychoanalyst, who understood it very well and was actually so pushy with his own theory of narcissism that people became convinced he was a narcissist. What I do know, along with most of you, I think, is that Freud developed a lot of his psychological ideas from the deep insights we get into human experience in classical Greek and Roman literature, like the Oedipus complex, for example. The most famous account of the myth of Narcissus is the long poem Metamorphoses by the Roman poet Ovid, which was written right around the time Jesus was a teenager. In one of the episodes in there, Ovid tells about a youth named Narcissus who was extremely beautiful, but also extremely cold. Girls and boys would flock to him in love, but he had no affection for anybody. When one of these girls tries to, quote, throw her longing arms around his neck, he bolted, shouting, "Keep your arms from me, be off, I'll die before I yield to you," end quote. When he was 16, this Narcissus comes upon a pool in a river, whither no shepherd came, nor any herd, nor mountain goat, and never bird, nor beast, nor falling branch disturbed its shining peace. In other words, a pool undisturbed by even a ripple. There, he sees his own reflection so clearly he doesn't realize it's just an image. And he falls completely in love with it. And he tries to lean down and kiss it and reach and embrace himself. His love goes unsatisfied. But he's unable to move away because then the image would disappear. So he eventually just wastes away and dies from starvation and love sickness on the shore there. It's such a great story, and psychologists like Freud and others have used it to describe personalities who are excessively in love with themselves, or who have extremely grandiose ideas about themselves and lack empathy with others. In the most recent psychology manual, the DSM-5, the traits of narcissistic personality disorder are these: grandiosity and self-importance, persistent fantasies of success, power, attractiveness, intellectual superiority or ideal love, sense of superiority and specialness, wish to be admired, strong sense of entitlement, manipulates and exploits others, lack of empathy, believes others are envious of him or her and in envy of others, arrogant and contemptuous attitudes and behaviors. So, you may be thinking of someone right now who seems to fit a lot of those categories. Hopefully it's not me. It can be tempting to label people as narcissists, especially successful and powerful people in the public limelight, even though, of course, it takes a lot of expertise and individual work to confirm an actual diagnosis. But also, all of us have some of these qualities to some degree, right? Or most of us. Freud talks about primary narcissism, which is basically the self-love that all infants have towards themselves, caught up in their own pleasure and a sense of omnipotence. Secondary narcissism describes people who, for some reason or other, carry on that dynamic into later life, as far as I know, which can be from parental neglect or the opposite, overindulgence, or some other reason. But there are writers who think that even adult narcissism is more common than we would expect. There is a book you may have heard of called The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch, written in the 70s, that argues that throughout the 20th century, American culture has become increasingly narcissistic as a whole, self-absorbed and self-indulgent, obsessed with images rather than reality, caught up with their own pleasure and lacking empathy for others, etc. That was in '79, and I kind of feel social media has probably made things worse since then, exacerbating those qualities and also spreading that culture well beyond the America that Christopher Lasch was talking about. So, with all of this in mind, I just want to go back and reread the Bible passage we heard this morning from Paul's second letter to Timothy, and just notice how well all of these traits of narcissism map on there. You must understand this, he says, that in the last days distressing times will come, for people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, arrogant, abusive, ungrateful, I don't need to read all of them, unfeeling, haters of good, treacherous, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to the outward form of godliness, but denying its power. Our culture of narcissism that Lash describes is a pretty good fit for what Paul was foreseeing here, or whoever authored that 2 Timothy passage. And although we might feel pretty special in this regard, of course, the problem of self-love has long preoccupied Christian writers, not just worrying about some future culture like ours, but as a pressing concern in their own times. When I hear someone like Brené Brown talk about the importance of self-love, she says this in the Atlas of the Heart: "We can love others only as much as we love ourselves." It always makes me a little uncomfortable because I think right away about some of these Christian writings from the past about the dangers of self-love. And especially when we're surrounded by a culture already so conducive to narcissism, loosely called, it just feels like we should approach the idea of self-love somewhat cautiously. Maximus the Confessor is a medieval Greek theologian who is one of my North Stars, I would say. Pretty top-notch, also put his money where his mouth was, or maybe the other way around. He literally defended what he was sure was orthodox to the point where he was exiled and had his tongue cut off so that he was unable to speak anymore, and his right hand cut off so he couldn't write anymore, only to have his position taken up by the entire Eastern and Western Church after he passed away. Anyways, for Maximus, self-love was a very central theme, to the point where he thought self-love was the source of all other sin. To really oversimplify, what he means by self-love is when we love ourselves as though we are some kind of self-sufficient, independent thing, self, if you want to call it that, in ignorance of our fundamental relationship with and dependence on God as our creator, like as having created us and continuing to create and sustain us in life. This independent self is an illusion, an image, just like what Narcissus sees in the water. And our bodies are what Maximus says give us this illusion, because they seem to be these individual things moving around as though they have their own life, even though in reality our bodies are in flux, constantly in flux, with food coming in and out, air coming in and out, water coming in and out. They're not actually individual like we see them. And it's the same for us as spiritual beings too. We are participating constantly in a greater spirit, but we tend to take our own perspectives too seriously. And this causes all sorts of division among people and what Maximus calls tyranny of oneself over others. So even when we love our neighbor, if we love them as though they are selves, independent things, this is a form of ignorance, which can ultimately be quite harmful. This is where baptism comes in. For Maximus, Jesus is obviously important. One of the reasons is that he didn't have the ignorance where he would approach himself and other things as being independent bodies. He approached everything and loved everyone as being a creation of God. And thus it was God that he loved in himself and in other people. For us, who aren't Jesus, this ignorance is just a fact of life. If we were left to our own devices, we'd be stuck in those harmful illusions and everything that they lead to, including cases of tyranny. But in baptism, we are able to participate in Jesus, in Christ, he thinks. And that means in the healthy relationship that Jesus had between God and himself, and that he experienced in all things. Baptism helps to wash away the things like ignorance that get in the way of a proper relationship, a causal relationship between God and us and other things we experience. And I don't have a lot of time here, but it helps to turn our sins into virtues, ways that our bodies can show their divine source, show that causality. And that's a whole other part in Maximus. Sins aren't just these bad things to be gotten rid of. They're like unique opportunities for love in our lives with God's grace. I love the language about baptism in the Gospel of John, where Jesus describes it as a birth of water and spirit. Along the lines of Max's thinking, it's like the old birth from our parents gets us pretty far, but the body we have from that birth can lead to these illusions of independence, etc., almost inevitably does, where we can love ourselves in slightly misdirected ways. Whereas a birth from water in baptism, water is this thing that is present everywhere, a river of life running through the land and our bodies and other creatures, and being born from that reconnects us to all those things in a way. And spirit, even more so. It's not isolated. You don't have images of it. It just blows. Who has seen the wind? The poem goes. Baptism connects us to life in a way that transcends and transforms our limited, ignorant perspectives. So that's a take that we get from Maximus. And I don't really have time for this final point, but I just want to say that someone like Maximus, as smart and orthodox as he is, baptism is more than his take, because that take is limited. It's a perspective from a certain time and place, just like any version of Christianity, even like Mennonite versions. Baptism has a way of connecting us to the source that transcends any one version. That's kind of what he's getting at. It's like the centerpiece of Christianity, especially Anabaptism, maybe, but it makes even Christianity apparent as an image. And as an illustration of this, we can read back into Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example, and find an account very similar to our flood narrative in Genesis, where the whole earth, I'm almost done here, but just stay with me for this last image. The whole earth experiences a kind of baptism and restoration. And the first thing that the two remaining people do in Ovid, this Roman writer, when dry land finally reemerges, is they get out of their boat, head to the river Cephisus, which is just returning into its previous form, and they baptize themselves. Quote, in ritual dew with holy water, sprinkling their heads and clothes. It's a ritual called chernips that people do multiple times in the rest of the poem and elsewhere in pagan literature. In other words, we don't own baptism. It would be like trying to privatize water itself. It's a public good, and any claims to the contrary would just be doubling down on our limited perspectives rather than opening ourselves up to grace and the healthy relationships that it can nurture in us. But yeah, lots more to explore in this regard. What is an Anabaptist in an age of narcissism? Very happy to continue that conversation with people over coffee or down at the river, and happy to wade further into those waters.